coming from. My daughter Carmen transitioned about 3 years ago, and we have been doing self-directed services essentially right out of the gate. We never went the traditional pathway. So, and I'm also a board member of the Self-Direction Advocacy Network, which is a group of people who advocate for people who are self-directing their services. And in particular, we meet with DDA on a monthly basis. And we also meet with Secretary Beatty from the Maryland Department of Disabilities on a quarterly basis. And we're a representative organization, and so what we do is we kind of poll our membership all the time, find out what's going on out there, and bring that to Deputy Director Simon's attention. And so that's kind of what we do. And so a lot of my thinking and learning has been kind of in that whole context. So what I would like to talk about, assuming that there we go. Okay, so I'm going to start out with a little bit of history, because when you deal with a government agency like the DDA, it's really helpful to know kind of what their mindset is. What is their worldview? So where are they coming from? And a lot of that has to do with the history of disability services. I'm going to talk about the whole creation of DDA and the waiver services. What does a waiver mean? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about traditional versus self-directed services and kind of give you a little taste of what it's like to administer a self-directed program. I'll talk a little bit about Carmen's self-directed life, and then I'll kind of finish up talking about sunshine projects, because I know that there is a great deal of interest in understanding how to pay for sunshine projects using your DDA budget. And so I'm going to kind of address some of those issues, and then I'm going to throw it open to questions. So if I don't address what you're interested in, I will be happy to talk about it afterwards. And also, I kind of have realized that some people that are here haven't even transitioned into DDA services at all. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that process, and try to unpack all this alphabet soup that we're trying to deal with. People throw these acronyms around all the time, and I know that when Carmen was transitioning, it was like, I had no idea what they were talking about. What's a CCS, and what's CMS, and all of these really important things that you need to understand if you're kind of in this world. So hang on, I'm really going to try to unpack all of that stuff, and then we can answer questions at the end. Okay, so understanding what DDA's mindset is, we really are going to go back to the really bad old days, which is when people with intellectual disabilities were sent to live in institutions. That was the norm. And honestly, it was bad for everybody. It was really bad for people with intellectual disabilities. They really didn't get any kind of stimulation. They would sit in the corner or sit on the table, as this young man is doing, and, basically just stare at the wall. And unfortunately, this was the norm until the mid-70s. So this is actually pretty recent. In the mid-70s, I was in college. That was what happened to people even, during my lifetime. So people started to realize that this was not a good thing. And so they started, for example, not necessarily immediately taking people and putting them in institutions. They were starting to do physical inclusion in schools, right? But totally separate classrooms. And you had special ed over here in this separate class or this separate building. And everybody else was in school over there doing their thing. Really, the whole concept of mainstreaming people with intellectual disabilities into society, we're talking 1981. This was really quite recent. And the institution that kind of started the whole movement, which was Willowbrook, it was an institute in upstate New York, and believe it or not, this is how Geraldo Rivero made his name. He was the one who did the investigative research into what was going on at Willowbrook and was part of what facilitated getting it closed down. So one of the most egregious things that happened was that they were using people with intellectual disabilities to do hepatitis B experiments. So they would infect these people with hepatitis B, and then they would try all these different treatments, and they would see, they'd follow disease and see how it was going. I mean, it was just, horrific. And so That started the whole movement to close down these institutions and mainstream the people with intellectual disabilities into regular life. Okay. So that was all part of the response. So one of the things that had to happen was that there had to be a funding mechanism outside of just sending money to an institution to take care of people with intellectual disabilities. And so in the 1970s, while this was all happening, Medicaid expanded to cover people with disabilities. So that became the funding source. In 1990, we had the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that, of course, supported people with intellectual disabilities as well as people with physical disabilities. 1991 was when the IDEA passed. So those of us who have lived through IEP meetings, it could be worse. We could have absolutely no leverage over the school system, and that was the case until 1991. So this is pretty recent. The whole independent living movement really had its roots in the mid 90s. And the woman whose picture I have here, her name is Judy Heumann, and she's considered like the mother of all disability rights. The Washington Post called her a badass, and I totally agree with that. I have met her virtually, and she's amazing. One of the books that was written about her is called Rolling Warrior. She's awesome. And I'm very grateful for all of the work that she did with the whole independent living movement and disability rights and everything that she has done. So we had Medicaid funding, but we really didn't have a mechanism to get that Medicaid funding to people with intellectual disabilities. So CMS is the first acronym I'm going to throw at you. That is the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services. And this is the federal office that controls all of the rules regarding home and community-based services. That's another acronym, HCBS. And that really is kind of the overarching set of regulations that controls all of our DDA services, the regulations at the federal level. Okay, so we'll get back to CMS in a little bit. Okay, so you have probably heard the term waiver thrown around. Okay, up until the early 80s, all Medicaid services were by law required to be provided in an institutional setting. Okay, there was no such thing as home and community-based services. It was not allowed. Okay, so in the early 80s, they waived the requirement that these services had to be provided in an institution. Okay, so it took about 10 years for that whole concept of waivers to filter throughout all of the different states, okay? And really waivers started in the early 90s. So that's really when we started to see the beginning of the services that we now all enjoy, okay? And the way that happens is that the Medicaid waiver is produced by the state and then approved by CMS, okay? So that's how that happens. But these waiver programs allow the provision of services to people who would otherwise be in an institution, nursing home, hospital, or long-term care, okay? So I want you to understand that a huge amount of what DDA does is still based in institution thinking, okay? That is the legal framework in which they are doing their thing. So a lot of times when you see these rules come out that just seem like they, we're through the looking glass, it doesn't make any sense. This is why. This is still very much part of the thinking. Okay, so one of the really big shifts in disability services was the whole concept of person-centered planning, okay? So this is not, an institutional setting where we decide what's going to happen and we are very paternalistic and we take care of the people with disabilities. The mind shift was people with disabilities ought to be able to make decisions for themselves. And everybody wants to live the life they want to live, If I don't like bowling, I shouldn't be forced to go bowling. If I really want to do this other thing and it's possible, maybe I should be allowed to do that, right? To make my own decisions and control my own life, okay? So really the thinking of that started in the 80s, and actually University of Maryland was one of the places that really moved this thinking forward, okay? And so from just an idea in the ivory tower back in the 80s until, to really being a part of how disability services happen, that was really like 2014. So CMS, that Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services at the federal level, now includes a person-centered plan in its rules for home and community-based services. Okay? So that is now an integral part of all of the activities that we do with the DDA. Okay? So PCP, super important. Again, that's going to be a part of the process that we're going to talk about. Okay, so here's kind of what the priorities are now. Okay, the pendulum really has swung largely intellectually from the whole institutional thinking all the way to where now all the planning for these services is person-centered, so it's specific to individuals with developmental disabilities. Okay, their focus is on community membership. So again, we don't want to, stick anybody in the corner and that sort of thing. We want them out into the community and focused on community employment. Okay, so up until probably 10 years ago, there were a lot of sheltered workshops, and that's what would happen. So, you would go to a provider would work with this sheltered workshop, they would bring everybody there, they would stuff envelopes, they would plant plants, they would, do these particular things at way below minimum wage. And, whether that was the best thing for you to do or not. So everybody went and stuffed the envelopes or planted the plants or whatever it was, okay? And so, again, the shift is to let's everybody get a job that's appropriate for them and that will provide them with a certain amount of income. Okay, so that's kind of the new thinking about disability benefits, and, it's fantastic. So, all right. So, here's the alphabet soup slide, okay? So let me unpack this, and we'll start from the left-hand side. Okay, CMS, that is the federal group, right? Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, okay? They are the ones who have all of the federal laws, okay, that govern home and community-based services, okay? So we then have the state organization, which is the DDA, and the Developmental Disabilities Administration, and it is part of the Maryland Department of Health, and it is a deputy secretary level position. So the person who is in charge of the DDA is Deputy Secretary Bernie Simons. Okay, so the way this works is that CMS has a bunch of rules, and actually they're fairly flexible. They really want to give states the ability to implement these rules in the best way possible for that state. So the state writes a waiver. Okay, they then take that waiver and they send it to CMS to get approval. Okay, so there's some back and forth there, and then CMS ultimately approves the waiver. Okay, and then once you have an approved waiver, the CMS starts sending money to the DDA. Now, the way the funding works is that half of the funding for all of our services is provided by the state of Maryland, and it's a budget line item, okay, sent to the DDA, and then that is matched by federal tax dollars through the CMS. Okay, so if the state puts in $1 million, CMS, as long as all the rules are followed, CMS will kick in $1 million too. Okay, so now let's sort of move down from the big groups to an individual with intellectual disabilities. Okay, there is a person that basically sits between the DDA and a person with disabilities, okay, called a coordinator of community services, or a CCS. Okay, that is your case manager. That is the person who is supposed to assess the person with a disability, discuss the needs for services for that person with a disability, put together the person-centered plan, and submit that to the DDA, okay, for approval. So they're kind of the hub that's a super important piece of this. For those of you who have not yet transitioned, you probably have a CCS who may or may not have even introduced themselves to you, but that person is going to be really important in your life. So definitely you want to get a close relationship going with your CCS. Okay. Typically, they are not government employees, they are contractors. And so you will see names like Service Coordination, Inc. They are a contractor who provides CCS services for the DDA. So that's kind of how that all works. Okay, so let's say that you are in your transition year, or really any budget year. You are going to meet with your CCS. You are going to talk about the needs of the person with intellectual disabilities. Okay. The very first time you do this during your transition year, one of the things that the CCS is going to do is they're going to go through this questionnaire, this inventory, okay, called the HRST. Okay, and they are going to give you a score that's associated with the intensity of needs for that particular person. And that takes into account the person's behavioral needs, the person's medical needs, the person's, all of that stuff. And they're going to ask you incredibly personal, nosy questions. And you unfortunately have to put up with it. That's just part of the deal of doing this. For those of you who have not yet done an HRST, let me just give you a little bit of advice. The HRST is going to drive the services for your loved one for a substantial period of time. And those of us who have adult children with disabilities, we want to always put them in the best light, right? We want to think about all the stuff that they can do, all of these wonderful things. Please do not cheat your child by doing that, okay? You need to answer as if this was your child's worst day. Now, I'm not saying make stuff up, okay? But there is the day they wake up bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and they're excited about life and, everything is great, okay? That's not the day they really need services. The day they need services is the day they've woken up, they've wet the bed, they're hating life, they're having a tantrum, hissy fit on the floor. That's the day you want to talk about because you want your services to be able to support them on that day, okay? So don't lie, don't make stuff up. I'm not telling you to do that. I'm just saying, tell them realistically what that worst day looks like. Okay, and so that's how you should answer those HRST questions. Okay, so you've done your HRST, you've gotten your score, and then you're going to go into this person-centered planning process. And again, if your CCS is doing what they're supposed to, they're going to ask you a whole bunch of different nosy questions. And really that is to determine what kind of supports your individual needs. And again, that's going to include things like interests. That's going to include things like medical issues. That is going to include all sorts of things that are going to then turn into budget line items. Okay, so that's really the purpose of the PCP. So you sit down with your CCS, you do your PCP, the PCP gets entered into this computer system called LTSS. That's what kind of manages all of the money, okay? Not to be confused with the Office of Long-Term Services and Supports, which is part of the Maryland Department of Health, and kind of its own acronym. I'm talking about the computer system that's called LTSS Maryland. Okay, so after the PCP is put in and is approved by DDA, then the CCS is going to get back together with you and they're going to talk about a budget. And this is where you're actually talking about, okay, how many hours of personal supports do you need? How many hours of community development do you need? That's the kind of conversation you have there, okay? The budget is then also put into LTSS, okay? Once it is approved by DDA, okay, that's when the money flows. And this is where we differentiate between traditional and self-directed services, okay? So that's why I have that big old box with a question mark. That's where the services are actually provided, okay? Everything I have just talked about, it happens for everybody, okay? If you're getting DDA services, this is the process that you're going to go through. After your first PCP, a lot of times it's not a really extensive process because you pretty much have everything about the individual in the system. So really you just need to talk about what's changing, what's going on, tweaks that need to be made, like, hey, we had this budget and we found that we just needed more of this because, whatever the reason. Okay. So let me talk first about traditional services because this is super easy, okay? That question mark just simply gets replaced with, with a provider. Well, there we are, okay, right? And a lot of times, you don't even have to necessarily argue about the budget. If you have traditional services, it's very likely that your provider is going to be working with the CCS to get the budget line items necessary for that provider to provide the services consistent with the PCP. Okay, so the nice thing is the money goes right to the provider. You don't have to do any administrative stuff. The services come from the provider. We hope those services are excellent. That may be the only place that you personally have to intervene if you have a provider and they're not doing what they need to do. Okay. So now we're going to move on to the self-directed model, and you're going to see there are a few more boxes here, okay? And this is basically the big difference between traditional services and self-directed services. You have a great deal more flexibility in self-direction, and along with that, you have a lot more administration, and you have to get under the hood. You have to know about, all of these different services and all of that sort of stuff. So that double question mark broke out into 4 boxes. Okay, so let me talk about these boxes. And again, this is only for self-directed services. Okay, so that budget, they don't just write you a check for, $100,000, right? They want to make sure that that money is spent according to the rules, according to the waiver, meeting those CMS requirements, okay? So if there's one thing I would say about DDA, their number one desire is not to go to jail. Okay, that is where they are coming from. It's great if we also provide outstanding services, but their number one goal is not to go to jail. Okay, so that's where they're coming from, and that's where a lot of those rules and regulations come from. So money goes to an organization called a fiscal management service. That's the FMS on the bottom of that stack of boxes, okay? And they are the ones who manage all the money. They're checking to make sure that all the expenses are legitimate, that they all are supported by the budget, that, all of that. So very little of that money will ever end up in the family's hands. It's only going to be reimbursement for things that you have paid for that are in your budget. And if a family member acts as staff, they would receive a paycheck directly from the FMS. Okay. So the FMS is the bank. Okay. Services are provided by staff, which you are able to hire. Okay. It may or may not be a family member. Okay. Oops. Uh-oh, it looks like my Zoom session may have crashed again. Oh. So can we still see? Okay.
The Zoom is open. The presentation is no longer on the screen. We can hear everything you're saying.
Let me reshare my screen. Okay. Was that the last thing you saw?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. All right. So staff is where I was. So in self-direction, you hire your own staff. So the good news is you get to hire your own staff. The bad news is you have to hire your own staff. Okay. And it is your staff who provide all of those services. Okay. Again, because this staff is working one-on-one with your participant, you have a tremendous amount of flexibility. Any legal thing that you can do under your DDA budget, you're able to do, okay? So again, great flexibility, and with that comes responsibility and bookkeeping, okay? The third box is vendors, okay? And when we talk about Sunshine Projects, I want you to remember that box because that's in a self-directed program where Sunshine Projects fits, okay? But it's not just Sunshine Projects, it is any vendor. It could be, a gym. It could be an equestrian center. It could be, whatever. Okay. So the vendors are the organizations that provide some of those services that are approved in the budget and that are consistent with the PCP. And the FMS either pays the vendors directly or they reimburse you after you have paid the vendors and you provide essentially the receipt for that. Okay, the last person I want to talk about is a support broker. So a support broker is an optional service. You do not have to have a support broker, but I kind of look at a support broker is like life insurance. You are perfectly able to go through life without any life insurance, but who on earth would want to, right? Support brokers are covered in your budget. It does not take away from any of your services. This is somebody who is there to help with the administration, okay? This is the person who double checks you on your time cards. This is the person who helps you get set up in self-directed services to begin with. This is the person who makes sure that everything that you do follows the rules, right? They're just kind of your corporate knowledge of how to do this self-direction thing. Okay, so they will work with your CCS. Generally, every time you have a budget meeting, your support broker will be there as well. And they help the person with intellectual disabilities. And this is super important if there isn't family support. So probably most of the people on this call, we are there to support our kids, right? What happens, heaven forbid, if one of us gets hit by a bus? Okay, that support broker is your backup who will help you and help your person with the disability make sure all of that paperwork stays legal. Okay, and again, support broker only in the self-directed model, FMS only in the self-directed model, staff built into your provider, vendors only who the provider chooses to pay. Okay, so again, with self-directed services, you just have to, you've got more levers of control and more levers of, you have to work those levers, okay? So let me introduce you to the stuff that you need to be aware of when you are self-directed, okay? So this is a budget sheet. So unlike traditional services where you basically say, okay, we need, 20 hours of personal supports and 20 hours of community learning, here's the money, here you go, provider, provide those 40 hours, in those categories. And that's all you have to think about. Here, you need to actually think about a lot of these different services. And so I don't mean to scare you, but I want you to get a realistic picture of what you have to think about. Okay, so this is just an example of a self-directed budget. And I will tell you that not every service that you can get is one that I'm going to talk about, because honestly, I just don't know about certain things. We don't have nursing services. We don't have behavioral services. Those are things that are available to you as a self-directing family unit, right? The individual legally is the employer. The person with disabilities legally has budget authority. You can help them with that, okay? But this is the self-directing individual. So again, keep that mindset, even though families obviously want to provide a lot of that support. Okay, so let me just go through a couple of pages of this, okay? So the first line is that support broker. Again, unique to self-directing services. You get up to 15 hours built into this budget when you start self-directing your services, okay? That is to basically get you up and running in the self-directed model. It's free. It does not reduce your services, okay? Please, if you are transitioning to self-direction, take advantage of this. This is awesome, and it's so helpful. Okay, now, most people hire support brokers as vendors. So most of this page is if you have a support broker as an employee. That never happens. I don't even know of anybody who has an employee support broker. So that very last line, the support broker -vendor/contractor, that's usually the one that you are going to fill out. Okay, so this particular person has a vendor support broker for 4 hours a month at a rate of $55 an hour. okay? And that's completely within normal and customary rates, okay? Times 12 months, that's your budget number over there on the right. Okay, next one, personal supports. Okay, so this is one of the very typical kinds of services that most people with intellectual disabilities would get. And the way I think about personal supports is this is the stuff that you do at home. Okay, this is a lot of activities of daily living. So personal supports would be making a grocery list, taking them to the store to get stuff to put in their fridge, helping them to cook that stuff, helping them to prepare those meals, helping them learn how to clean their bathroom, learning how to clean up their room. Okay, that's all personal support. So I think, oh no, I'm getting this shaking of the head, right? Yeah, that's
He
what.
knows it for a fact because that's what his personal support does with him.
Exactly. That's what Carmen's personal support person does with her. You know, they are constantly, so any of you who know much about Carmen know that she loves fashion. And she's my youngest child. She has been the hand-me-down recipient of all of my oldest daughter's clothes, all of my son's clothes, all of my mother-in-law, so my daughter's mother-in-law, her clothes when she cleaned out her closet. And then anything that we buy, we have a ton of wigs, we have all this stuff. Well, the clothes just, eat our house from time to time. And so we have to go through and we have to get rid of the clothes. And thank goodness we have Angel as her personal supports person, because she will listen to Angel and she will say, okay, we really need to lose this shirt. Even if it's your favorite shirt, it's got a huge stain, it's got a rip in it, it's got to go. And it's sort of like, okay. So anyway, so that's what personal supports are about. That is the activities of daily living typically done inside your home. Okay. And here's an example. We're doing 15 hours a week. We're paying $18 an hour times that many weeks. There's your budget. Okay. Now, since many of you probably live in Montgomery County, again, this is something I know about. I don't know a huge amount, but there are some rules about having sick leave available to your employees. And so in Montgomery County, hopefully your CCS will know exactly what this means and will put in your sick and safe leave. Okay. Now, for the rest of us who do not live in Montgomery County, we do this through paid time off. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in this budget. Okay, so as part of personal supports, you can have mileage. And so when Angel takes Carmen to get a pedicure, the mileage gets paid for. I will talk a little bit about some of the things that are not paid for. Okay, so Angel's time to take Carmen for a pedicure is paid for. Angel's mileage to take Carmen for a pedicure is paid for. The pedicure is not paid for by DDA. That comes out of our pocket. Okay, so again, when you think about these services, you can have pieces of things covered, but not other things. And you know what? As a whole bunch of taxpayers, you shouldn't be paying for Carmen's pedicure, right? And that's okay. When she goes to the movies, the time that Angel is there with her is paid for. The mileage is paid for. That movie ticket, not paid for, okay? Now, we usually go to a place that will give Angel an entrance for free, but Carmen pays for her own movie ticket. She pays for her bowling lanes, right? She pays for, when we go to the pottery patch, she pays for the piece of pottery that she's painting, okay? That's all on us. The support that she needs to be able to do those things, to live her life the way she wants to do, that is what's paid for, okay? So again, be careful what you're expecting. All right. Here are some other things, again, because you guys live in civilization, you have access to things like Uber or taxis or public transportation, okay? Where I live in cow country. There is no bus that comes to us. There is no Uber in our neighborhood. That's it. We have staff transportation, we have mommy's taxi, and for her to get a ride from our house to her job is like over $25 per trip. So for her to work would be $50 a day. She earns $55 a day before taxes, okay? It doesn't work out. So count your blessings that you live here. So, all right. Then 14% for taxes, that includes workers' comp, that includes FICA and FUTA and Social Security and all of that stuff. Okay, so those are all the payroll taxes, which again are going to be done by the FMS as part of that payroll processing. Okay, anything else I wanted to talk about? Okay, there is another option, and it's like 2/3 of the way down, that personal supports vendor/contractor. Okay, when we talk about Sunshine Projects, once Sunshine Projects becomes an approved DDA provider, one option that you have for self-directed services is to buy a certain number of hours of supports from a vendor. I'm sorry, not a vendor, a provider, okay? Whether that's Sunshine Projects or the ARC or whatever, or Seek or whoever all you guys have, okay? That is an option that you have. So any DDA approved provider can provide some of these supports on a negotiated basis, okay? So let's say out of those, what did we say, 20 hours a week of personal supports, if I want Carmen to come to Sunshine Projects for 8 hours 1 day a week, I can take 8 of those hours and put them down in that vendor line, and I can have all the rest of those provided by her direct support person. All right, emergency and backup staff. Honestly, that's something to think about, because when you are working with a provider, if somebody doesn't show up for work, that's their problem, right? They have to make the phone calls and find someone to fill that shift. When you are self-directed and your staff person doesn't show up, guess whose problem it is, okay? You have to make sure that your loved one with a disability is safe, okay? And so you either need to do it yourself, or you need to make sure that you have someone on call that can cover that shift. Okay. All right, respite. Okay, so this is another big set of services that you have access to as a self-directed person, okay? And the idea here is, if you would like to take a weekend away and have your loved one provided for, to make sure that they are safe and busy, that is one of the things that you can do. So we usually have a few hours. So my husband and I, usually we go to a Jimmy Buffett concert. So that's usually what we use our respite for. We go to Jiffy Lube and we stay in a bed and breakfast, and we put on our shark hats and go crazy. And Carmen doesn't have to see all that. So she would be thoroughly embarrassed by our behavior. So the other thing that you can do with this respite is this would cover your summer camps. Okay, so that's another use of these respite funds. So, Marcy, I see your hand is up. Can you give me just a few minutes and let's talk at the end of this, just because I'm going to lose my train of thought. So just make a note of what your question is. Awesome. Okay. All righty. So, I'm sorry, here's the camp. So the top part of this page is where you put in your camp. Okay. I'm going to say, if you have that HRST rating of 3 and above, okay, typically that means that there are medical issues involved, okay? And so you have an option for nursing support services. If you have that high HRST, meaning you have intense needs, you sort of have to have that, because you need a nurse to evaluate your HRST and to monitor the care that your loved one is getting. So anybody with diabetes is probably going to end up with a nurse coming in to check on things. Okay. That's about as much as I know about nursing services, because, you know, very fortunately, Carmen has been pretty healthy, so we haven't had to have a whole lot of nursing involvement. Okay. So this next line is another really, really important one, particularly if you are looking for how Sunshine Projects plays into this whole thing. This individual and family directed goods and services, lovingly known as IFDGS, okay? This is how all of that stuff gets paid for, okay? So swimming, so I'll tell you, I pulled these numbers actually out of Carmen's budget, okay? We pay for swimming. We go swim with the Terrapin Masters at University of Maryland. That is what it costs to have a master's membership at University of Maryland, okay? Plus she does a summer swim program that's pretty inexpensive, and a few dollars is thrown in for that as well. Okay, dance. So in Carmen's case, she is a ballroom dancer, and so we need to have money for lessons, for all that sort of stuff. Sunshine Projects, okay, we are members of the virtual program, so that $100 a month for access to the virtual programs, that's built into her budget. Okay, so every month we pay Elma, and then we take that invoice and we ship it off to our support broker and say, here you go. We also are involved with camps. So the two that we have time to do are acting out, and it used to be Access Hollywood, now it's animated acting or whatever it's turned into, but that Friday night thing and Saturday night club, those are the two that we do. Okay, and so again, all of those things are built into her budget. And so when we pay for those vendor costs, we pay, we get the invoice, we get the payment receipt, we send those to the support broker, she sends us back a form, which is that whole package is what has to be submitted to the FMS. We sign the form, we send it back, boom, it goes to the FMS, and eventually a check kind of meanders back into the bank account. Okay. The next thing is that staff recruitment and advertising, okay? Everybody should put that money in their budget, okay? Because you never know when, your staff person gets pregnant or, whatever, moves to Montana or whatever it is, okay? There are costs associated with looking for new staff members. You might want to join care.com. You might want to post some kind of an advertisement in your local newspaper, whatever you're going to do, you want some money available to be able to do that staff recruitment. So we have an amazing staff person. I hope never to have to replace her. That's probably not realistic, but the money's in the budget and we hope never to use it, put it right back on the table and give it back to them. Okay, I did mention behavioral support services. I don't know a great deal about those. They are available to you if you need them. Okay, and like I say, I'm going to have to pass on any questions about that because I just simply don't know what is legal, what isn't. So, okay, that's something you would discuss with your CCS and your support broker. So, all right, so here's the next really big section of hours for services, and that is community development services. So we talked about personal supports being everything you do in the house. Community development is when you hop in the car and go, okay? And this is integrating your loved one into the community, whether that is, getting a pedicure, whether that's doing a ceramics class, whether that is, whatever, going to lunch, okay? This is everything that you're doing out there in the community. Okay, so that's kind of how I think about it. So in this case, we have 23 hours a week. You have staff making $18 an hour times the number of weeks, and boom, there's your total. Okay. You are able to pay your staff a certain set of benefits. Okay, these are all legal that you can offer to your staff person. You don't have to, but you're welcome to do this. Okay, health benefits. So you can pay on a reimbursement basis for their health insurance. So they would pay their insurance broker, they would give you an invoice, you would, submit that to your support broker, you have to sign a form, off it goes to the FMS, and eventually the check ends up back in their checking account. Okay, paid time off. So that's another thing that you can do that covers, for those of us not in Montgomery County, that covers our sick leave, that covers, when we take off with Carmen to go somewhere, it's not fair to ask them to not get paid for a week because we chose to take a vacation. So that's another option for paid time off. Or when she wants to take a trip, she can use paid time off to cover her time. So and again, it needs to be reasonable, but that's something that you can provide. So we have her work about 20 hours a week. So we have basically given her 2 weeks of Carmen time. Okay. What else? Okay, mileage. So again, you have separate buckets of money for personal supports mileage and community development mileage. You don't have to put it in 2 buckets. This is just easy because one bucket is Angel's, one bucket is mine for when I'm dragging her all over the county, or all over the state, I really should say. Okay, so that's just basically how we divide it. You don't have to make it complicated if you don't want to. Okay, so let me see. Okay, so there are other line items in the budget, but a lot of them are really specialized for particular situations, and so I really didn't want to go over that. But this is what you would do with your support broker and your CCS while preparing this budget. Okay, this is actually the tool that they use to compute that budget. And the big number, you see that big red arrow? Okay, that is the big budget. Okay, so in this case, it was $100,000. Okay, at the bottom, when you add up all of your self-directed services, the number you actually are asking for is usually a lot less than that, and that's okay. The goal here isn't to get every nickel out of that budget. The goal is to get the proper services for your loved one. Okay, so that should be your mindset when you're thinking about it. If your loved one needs more personal supports, go fight for it. Okay, but if you've asked for everything that you need, and the number at the bottom is not as big as that big number, congratulations, you've saved the taxpayers money. Okay, that big number is what they would send to a provider. Okay, and self-directed services just sort of almost, in general, is like half the price to 2/3 of the price of a provider managed program. Okay, so all of that gets crunched into LTSS, the software system, and then that gets sent to your FMS, and this is what comes back, okay, from the budget that we just kind of looked at. Okay, so in this case, one of the 2 FMSs is the ARC of Central Chesapeake. That's all they do. They are the bank. Okay, there's another one called MedSource. That's not the one we use. I don't know a lot about it, but I've heard really good things about them. The FMSs are just fantastic, and they're really responsive. I have had in 3 years one problem, and literally I sent one email, I watched the email traffic happening, and they got back to me and fixed the problem like in a couple of days. So they are super responsive. Love these guys. Okay, so you can see those services. You get a support broker, you get a whole bunch of, there's your IDGS, your vendor costs, there are your respite, your personal supports, your community living, your taxi and van service, everything that actually had a number in it on that big budget spreadsheet that we just went through, gets consolidated. And this is what comes to you every month from your FMS. Okay, so you're submitting all these things, you're submitting timesheets, you're submitting vendor receipts, you're submitting, all this stuff, right? And they are adding it all up, okay? And they are helping you manage your budget. Now, you are responsible to make sure that you do not exceed any of these budget lines. You do have a little bit of flexibility, and like towards the end of every budget year, it's not unusual for us to ask for a budget mod to just kind of shuffle some money around. But you will never exceed your approved number. Okay, that isn't going to happen, and you need to manage your budget carefully. Okay, so but again, there's a system set up to help you, and in the case of the ARC, they've got webinars, they've got video things. They will help unpack this stuff, and usually behind this is a whole bunch of ledger information. Okay, pay period 1, pay period 2, pay period 3, all the exact numbers, so you can see exactly how your budget is being spent. You don't get this kind of insight into what's going on if you're dealing with a provider. The need to stay inside that budget is not your problem. It's their problem. If they spend more than is allocated, they have to eat that cost, okay? If you spend more than is allocated in self-directed services, you eat that cost, okay? You won't get reimbursed, okay? You won't get a paycheck. So you have to, so one of the downsides of doing self-direction is you have to look under the hood. You have to keep this kind of stuff in mind and manage it, okay? It's not a huge deal, but it is something you have to do. So pros and cons of self-direction. I am totally in the tank for self-direction. it has made, Carmen has a wonderful life, and it would not be possible to do that in a provider organization. Okay. So the thing we love about self-direction is the flexibility and how tailored it is to her needs, her wants, her interests, right? She loves to do fashion. She and Angel, play with makeup. They play with their fingernail polish. They try on all these different outfits. They have play dates in her closet. So, it's awesome. And it really is able to allow her to be everything that she can be. Okay. The downside, as I hope I have convinced you, is you have administrative work to do. Okay. I am 100% in favor of having a support broker. It will really help you, especially that first year, right? And when I started the self-direction, that was kind of the plan. I was going to hire a support broker, get started, they would teach me what to do, and I'll take it from here, right? You will pull my support broker out of my cold, dead hands. She is awesome, and she is so helpful. And it's not that I'm not a smart person, it's she just knows. Such a deep body of knowledge in that brain of hers. I just really appreciate it. And she just makes sure that I get everything done. She's got her little checklist, and it's awesome. So I would highly recommend help, getting that kind of help. Okay, so Sunshine Projects. I know that some of you are particularly interested in making that happen. Okay, so Sunshine Project is actually one of the really rare things that really supports both kinds of methods, right? Most people who are providers. That's all they do, okay? And they don't really have a whole lot to do with self-directed people. Most self-directed people are really focused on vendors and not really necessarily bringing providers on board, okay? But so one of the things that they are doing at this point is applying to become an approved DDA provider. Once that happens, you can then do the day program essentially as a traditional program. Okay, so that is going to be one of those options. Also, once they become an approved provider, the option, if you are self-directed, to buy hours in this program for, to cover some of those services becomes an option as well. Okay. So you have to agree with that with Elma, not knowing she's going to have 10 people this day and 2 people this day, that may not fly. Okay. But legally and in the budget, it is a possibility. So I'm going to leave it there because that's above my pay grade, right? Now, in terms of self-direction, things like the online program, okay, that is so beautifully tailored for self-directed services. Okay, all of those programs can be covered, and I've even showed you where, under that IFDGS line item. Okay, it is capped at $5,000. You cannot spend more than $5,000 on these vendor-based services. Okay, so you are not going to be able to pay for a day program with Sunshine Projects using self-directed services until they are an approved vendor, okay, or I'm sorry, an approved provider. Okay, so as it is right now, they are fine as a vendor. You can do your monthly online costs, your camps, your cooking camps, anything, any program that they offer, in person or virtual, under that IFDGS, up to a cap of $5,000. Okay. So that hybrid agreement will come into effect once they're approved. Okay, so okay, so that is all that I had planned. Okay, let me get back here. Let me